ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this discussion at ORF. This is not what we call Mann Ki Baat or fireside chat, but still, let's hope since the rain is out there, this will be a warm and comfortable discussion. I have the pleasure of presenting to you Dr. Daya Thussu, who is a distinguished professor in China. He's the Disney chair at the Tsinghua University.
Yes.
At the Tsinghua University, and he's started his academic career in JNU. That's where he did his PhD in international affairs, and that's actually his only claim to fame because I studied there at the same time. Everything else is subsequent. I'm not going to go into any detail of what he's going to talk about, since I know very little about the subject. But it's true that you've simply seen a spate of many countries beginning to spread their information networks across the world. Of course, we are all aware about Russia and Facebook and Russia Today and all, but Chinese media has a much longer history and actually a far more sophisticated operation, if you want. When I was in China, in fact, when I watched Chinese English language television, I found their news to be far superior to, for example, what we have today in India. You know, there is a level of presentation, there is a sophistication of presentation. Yes, there is a viewpoint, but it is not an in-your-face Arnab Goswami style viewpoint. It's far more subtle than that. And sometimes if it's a topic that you don't really know much about, you might even miss it, you know, and you come back with a completely different view of what the world is. So I think these are issues that we all have to be aware of, particularly as people who study China or study media and as academics. And of course, another thing is that I think this is an area which India is sorely missing from. And we may discover that we also have to direct some of your energy and resources to make up in this particular area. But now I leave the floor to Daya for his presentation.
Thank you, and apologies in advance for my rather delayed approach. I was supposed to be here at 2:45, but I had an amazingly competent driver who told me he knew everything about how to get to this place, but we were stuck in traffic, and anyway, I had to walk the last mile to get here. It is indeed a privilege to be here with this very distinguished crowd, but also being chaired, the session being chaired by Nandan, who apart from our JNU association also have a journalistic association. We both worked at Press Trust of India many decades ago. And in those days, PTI was very substantial organization. It still is very substantial organization. And we used to have night shifts where we would sit and talk about the state of the world and our country, often heated discussions, you know, the old best JNU style. And I hope someone in here will tell Mr. Modi and his government that actually JNU is not anti-national. It's a fantastic intellectual atmosphere. Before I start talking about Chinese media's globalization, I would like to say a few words about where I'm coming from. I have an IR PhD, but I'm a communication professor. I've been for many years, mostly in London, at the University of Westminster, which has a very big media school, in fact, one of the biggest in the UK. And I was professor of international communication there since 2004. I also set up an India Media Center there, and I was advisor to the China Media Center, China Media Academic Advisor. And in that capacity, I was able to appreciate and understand a bit more about what was happening in China. But I have to admit I have no Mandarin, which is a great handicap, so I'm only engaging with the English language media from China. And I often used to go to the seminars of the China Media Center in London, which had a regular fortnightly seminar. You get people from China and China experts from different parts of the world. And often I would be the only non-Chinese person in the room, apart from my colleague who was the head of the center, who is British. And my Chinese students used to get a bit suspicious, why is this Indian guy attending all these seminars? And they would ask me, very politely, they would ask you, are you working on China? And I said, no, not really. But I teach a course, I taught a course in global media, and I have to say to them, if you're really serious about global, then China is a very important part of that globe, because every fourth person in the world is Chinese. In terms of purchasing power parity, Chinese economy is already the top since 2014. And so on and so forth. So as luck would have it, I was offered a Disney chair his inaugural Disney chair in global media to teach in an American college based in Tsinghua University. So it's in a way best of both worlds. You are in a space where you can access Google and New York Times and BBC, but you're also in the top university in China, a university which is very close to the current leadership in Beijing. And it is, I don't know how many of you have heard of Schwarzman College. Has anybody heard of it? Okay, couple, three, good. I didn't know it until last year. When I was invited to apply for this position, an old colleague in Beijing said to me, is this position, are you interested? I said, yes, I applied. They offered me a job. So being there actually is an extremely interesting and intellectually stimulating experience, because when you're looking at China from London or from New Delhi you don't look at China very much, but you don't get that sense of the complexity and the enormity of what the change, the transformation that's happening in China, and Chinese induced transformation around the world. So I feel very privileged to have that position, to be in a liberal elitist college in a very good university in China. So what I thought I'll do in today's session is to talk a bit about why Chinese media is globalizing, some of the limitations of that globalization that are related to the Chinese media systems and the structures. And I want to end with some reflections about what we in India can learn from the Chinese experience, especially in relation to the developmental issues. Is it the case that we have been so obsessed with the Western definition of what development is, what progress is, what media system should be like, that we have forgotten to look east and see what we can perhaps learn from what's happening in that part of the world? So I'm going to start with why China is going global. I'll very quickly go through this because this is familiar territory for this audience. Chinese hard power is on the rise. China is not just a rising power, it is the risen power. And as you see, from Australia to South China Sea to first military base in Djibouti in Africa, Chinese presence is visible around the world. Although a sense of proportion is necessary, because when Djibouti was declared as the first Chinese base, there was a lot of noise in Western media, especially in US media. And I would just simply submit that United States has 600 declared bases around the world. Actual number is in 4 figures. So let's not lose that sense of proportion, including France, of course. Chinese political and hard power is visible around the world. So more importantly is the economic power. Now, I did some data crunching from available data from Fortune 500. And as you can see in this slide, the number of Chinese companies in the Global 500 has been consistently raising. Every 5 years, they double. And there is a corresponding decline of number of companies which are based in the United States. Of course, multinational companies work in a very complex way, and ownership structures are complex, but it gives you a sense of some shift in power. The gap between the United States and China is now very limited, 132 and 109. And remember, it's only the last 2 decades when China actually started getting into the global corporate world. So that's another important fact to keep in mind. The Chinese investment is growing around the world, and therefore interest in the world, in this case corporate interest, market interest, is growing. Even more interesting is this chart, which I borrowed from Parag Khanna's very interesting book called Connectography. It's actually interesting. In my view, some of the most interesting work on China has come from non-Western scholars, including some Indian ones actually, because I think they look at it slightly differently. They don't have this kind of Western perspective what China equates censorship, period. Yeah? There's something more complex. And here is a map which shows the difference in terms of global trade. So the countries with which China is the biggest trading partner, 124. With the United States, 56. Right? So if you have as many countries with which you are the highest trading partner, you have investment, you have interest, you want to find out about their society, what people like, what they don't like, what is the political structure like, etc., etc. So an interesting shift in economic power, and well documented in UN reports and academic literature and policy literature around the world, and I'm sure in India too, although I don't see a lot of that here, unfortunately. Similarly, in terms of the soft power project, China, in fact, where I am in Beijing is a soft power project for both United States and China. It's a college which is supposed to create the future leadership. It's like the Rhodes Scholars in Oxford, which started in 1917. The idea was to create the next leadership to run the empire. Now the Chinese are doing it with American money, which is the interesting bit. So in terms of aid to developing countries, especially Africa, China is now threatening the old school, the old established powers, EU and United States, and Russia for that matter, and India too. And here is some recent work, academic work, which looks at this aspect of how aid is a safe soft power, and also media as soft power. The Chinese tend to this is a phrase that a colleague in Tsinghua coined, charm defensive, in response to the idea of charm offensive, the famous book which came out a few years ago. There's actually a lot of work There's a lot of work on China's soft power. In fact, last time I was here, it was a talk I'd given on the book I wrote on Indian soft power, which was the first book-length study on the topic. And I was just comparing that how much material there is on Chinese soft power. And China is a hard power, not a soft power. If we are a soft power, there's very little literature on it, which is a shame. But anyway, that's a different discussion for different panel. But the Chinese are, this phrase is quite interesting. It's charm defensive. They don't want to tell the world we're doing very well. They're quite, restrained, very modest. And they don't say we are, although in recent years, in the last 2 years, that's changed. There's a greater degree of assertiveness. But traditionally, it has been a win-win kind of argument, and generally being quiet and getting on with things. Unlike here, as Nandan was saying earlier about our news media, there's a lot of shouting, there's very little substance. But I'll come to that later when I talk about media. Even more significant, and something which we are all familiar in this country, is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which, as you can see on this map, has both a maritime version as well as a land-based version. And although this map, because it was from the Western sources, it shows Kolkata as part of the BRI, as we all know, it is not part of the. In fact, India was the only major country which did not agree with. I mean, they were not there at the time of the launch in 2 years ago, and for perfectly understandable reasons, because some of these projects, including the China-Pakistan economic corridor, passes through territory which is disputed, both internationally and in the region. And no government in Delhi, irrespective of its political affiliation or ideological affiliation, would agree to that. Although I know Indian companies are queuing up to be part of this extraordinarily transformational infrastructure project, which actually embraces 90 plus projects, a 10-year span, trillions of dollars are involved. And I would just mention one thing to think about. That Marshall Plan, what Marshall Plan did to Europe, this is 20 times bigger, and this has much bigger geographical reach. So just spare a thought about its long-term implications. They're actually going beyond Belt and Road. They're also talking of pole, right? Which is fascinating. So think of the vision. But they're thinking 30 years ahead. China is nowhere near the pole, or the North or South Pole. But the idea is that we're going to open up those trade routes and tourism, and we're going to develop it. And I'm not sure, don't quote me on this, but parts of Greenland are being bought by companies belonging to China. So this is the kind of contextual background, if you like, in terms of economic, political, and sort of hard power kind of context. There's an extraordinary expansion, and this hasn't happened yesterday. It's been going on for the last 2 decades. And the ambitions are that we're going to continue, and by 2020, we are going to become a developed country. And it's fascinating to see that kind of national project. Everybody is involved in getting on to becoming a developed country. We have to perhaps learn something from that, but that's for later discussion. Now, this BRI is so big that almost every university in China, some academic is doing a project on BRI, because there's always money for it. And of course, media and communication and culture, although it's not the most important part of the discussion, but it also increasingly figures in policy formulation. That if we are going to operate in Afghanistan, we need to know what is the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam. Right? We need to go beyond saying that Islam is a mental illness. Right? So there are really interesting questions to be raised about how do you deal in areas which have very different systems, cultural systems, religious beliefs, political systems, etc. But by and large, there's a very positive spin put on the BRI as a no problem issue, nothing to do with geopolitics. It's about development, and we're bringing infrastructure to countries which have been deprived of it. And it's all going to be good for everybody concerned. That's the kind of official dominant line. Also reflected in the media. Although outside world looks at it differently, not just India, but many countries in the West, especially United States, but also European countries are very concerned that, and Russia too, the near abroad of Russia is being increasingly influenced by Chinese investment. So there is a certain amount of discomfort bordering on worries about Chinese expansion. So that also reflects in media reference, as you see in this cartoon. I was very fortunate to work on a book which came out last year, at the beginning of last year, and this is the first book in English language which looks at the globalization of Chinese media. It emerged from a conference we had organized at Tsinghua University 3 years ago now. The book came out early last year. China's Media Go Global, with a colleague from my previous university at Westminster and Professor Shi and Ben, who is a very distinguished professor at Tsinghua University. In fact, I'm teaching a course with him at Schwarzman College. So, in terms of main media in China, internationally known and internationally visible, you have obviously the Xinhua News Agency, one of the oldest news agencies in the world, particularly powerful in developing countries. You have the CGTN, China Global Television Network, formerly called CCTV. This is the international wing of that. Then there's China Radio International, you have People's Daily, and you have China Daily. Again, one of the great privilege of actually being in Beijing is that we were taken to China Daily. I took my class to meet people there. It was a whole afternoon we spent with them. And then you look at the kind of facilities they have, and you think, gosh, we got so much to do. It's extraordinary. The sophistication of technology is... I haven't been to New York Times office, but presumably that's the only comparable. I can't imagine any newspaper in UK having that kind of resources. Although editorially we can talk about that, Now within these, the most significant is the CGTN, China Chinese television network, and as you see on this map, it has various editions, including in Russian, Arabic, French, Spanish, and also 2 specific channels for Africa and for America. They are planning this year to have a big launch of a special channel for Europe based in London. It hasn't happened, as far as I know, it hasn't happened yet, but it's planned, a very big presence for Europe. And for English-speaking world. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. Nandan mentioned he's seen some of it. I don't know whether it's available here, but I watch it regularly in London and in Beijing, of course. But it's available on the internet, and it's actually rather good. Especially since they changed the name in 2016. They called it CGTN. And the quality of programs, of course, within the political system, which is one-party state, there are also kinds of constraints you and me, or somebody living in the West can never imagine. That's all there. But in terms of the editorial content, not everything is political, right? Or everything is controlled by the state in that sense, that there is a much wider variety of stories. And it's particularly interesting in relation to Africa, because that's one of their focus areas. In fact, 2 of my PhD students did work on that. It was then called CCTV in Africa. And one is already published, another one is in the process of publishing. And one of them actually she was an ex-BBC correspondent, and she did a comparison between BBC's Africa service and CGTN's Africa service, and she found that actually the differences were not that strong. That's another interesting area of discussion. But the point is that it's not just what they are projecting as journalism, there's also a very strong infrastructural dimension to it, in terms of providing broadband connectivity, satellite connectivity for free. And so, okay, we'll give you broadband, but you have to subscribe to Xinhua. Also big is the China Radio International, which has the largest number of foreign language services of any broadcaster in the world. It also has, as I call it, client stations, which are essentially NGOs or private but funded by the Chinese government. Many of them, as this map shows, in the United States, at a very local level. So it's not just state propaganda, emanating out of Beijing, they have localized versions of it for audiences in various parts of Europe and United States. And Xinhua, of course, this takes me back to my PTI days, because I used to actually work in the, used to call the pool network, pool service. No, not news. It was, I have to say, it was the most wonderful experience to have been in a newsroom than to teach media or communication. Some of my colleagues have no idea what happens in newsroom. To have actually worked on it was a fantastic, fantastic training. So Xinhua, this is like, we're talking about 80s, early 80s. Xinhua was very widely used even then. And I was told that some of the copy was written by Indians who were based in Hong Kong. But it's grown, as you see, bottom of this, 180 news bureaus, comparable to the big three, AP, Reuters, etc. So Chinese media, in terms of journalism, is visible around the world. But the kind of journalism it promotes is very different from journalism that you and I are used to in this country, or journalism in the Western world, or in other words, the dominant version of journalism. And the money that the Chinese government spends on external communication, including broadcasting, is in the range of, exact figures are difficult to pinpoint, but we're talking billions of dollars annually. So it's more than the budget of BBC and CNN combined. But I'm still waiting for a Chinese news network or newspaper or radio station to break an international story. One story. I could name a dozen, RT even, I shouldn't say even, RT, Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, I can go on. Indian newspapers, Indian channels, that's not their game. They're not into that. The phrase that's used is constructive journalism, which is a borrowed phrase from some Danish work done on that topic. So it's as against critical journalism. And if you are a dictator in Africa, that's music to your ears. You don't want to hear anything critical, right? So if there's a choice between Reuters and Xinhua, you're going to go for Xinhua. Positive stories about Africa. That is not to say there is no need for such journalism. Very much needed. Because if you are only, doing critical reporting, then you miss out on a lot of stuff which happens around the world. Apart from journalism, China is actually also investing in other media. Quite a lot of money, including in entertainment media. So it hasn't got a Bollywood, it hasn't got soap operas of Turkey, it hasn't got the telenovelas of Brazil, which are exportable commodities, have been for many decades, and Bollywood from 1930s onwards. So what they're doing is they are actually asking Hollywood to make films which doesn't offend Chinese sensitivities. So they're funding films from Hollywood, or they're asking Hollywood to come and set up, studios there and train their people. And one of the outcomes is this film, which some of you might have heard or seen. It's called Wolf. There was a Wolf and then Wolf 2. Has anybody seen this? Okay. It's a very interesting film. And if you haven't go on internet, you'll find it. It's actually politically, I thought, was extremely interesting. Yeah. As a film, I wasn't very impressed by it. It's an interesting film, like in a James Bond, as has been said, in James Bond kind of film, kind of genre. But what was most interesting for me was the way it deals with, it's about terrorism, right, in Africa. But it deals with the issue of international law and sovereignty very intelligently, I thought, and very instructively. So there's a Chinese fleet waiting outside this country, the unnamed country, but it doesn't go in until it has approval from the United Nations Security Council. Remember, China is a permanent member. You don't see that in Hollywood. The American guy goes and sorts out problems, and even he goes to Mars and deals with it. Very interesting difference. And that point is emphasized, that we believe in rule of law, we believe in international law. Very interesting, I thought. And this is an area which is growing in terms of investment in cinema, production of films, production of entertainment. Another of my, not my direct student, but in my department, he wrote published already, a book about the Chinese historical dramas and how they've been exported to various countries. So if you are, you have a captive audience because you're paid for the broadband, and you have a channel which is only showing historical dramas. So in the entertainment space too, there is huge amount of investment, although the presence is not as widespread as in journalism, but it's growing. The problem is that unlike, for example, India, where people have an awareness of diversity, because we are a very diverse country. We have every religion, we have almost every ethnicity, we have different languages, we have different levels of development. The Chinese, this is my humble observation, I can't say it with any certainty, but my sense is that they are less aware of that diversity of the world. And especially the new parts of the world they are exploring. Islamic world, for instance, parts of Africa. And it is also reflected in some of their media representations of the other. A prominent example is this from last year's, they have this big TV gala, New Year gala evening. It goes on all night, and it's like billion people watch it. It's the biggest television event. And they had a woman, a Chinese woman dressed as African and talking with exaggerated African accent. Something that would not be approved of by the BBC or CNN or even Fox. They would think, oh, this is like 1960s. I don't know about India. I mean, we have very weird ideas about Africa. I've spoken to educated people, and they don't mind using N-word, because they don't see anything wrong with it. But actually, you can't say this. If you say this in London, you will be behind bars. This is actually, a criminal act. Anyway, so it's also that kind of understanding of the world where I think there is a lot more to do, because the representation of the other, and even the Western world, is very deeply problematic in my view. India almost, we'll talk about that later, India almost doesn't exist in the imagination. It's just outside it's too complex to comprehend. India is a market, yes, fantastic market. But to understand Indian culture, language, they can't understand. How can you live with different languages? They assume everybody speaks English because they meet Indians who are educated, professionals, they speak good English. And they assume that this is the lingua franca of this country. In fact, the tiny minority, as we all know, speak that language as their first language. But I think, to my mind, the most significant change that is happening in Chinese media space, and more broadly Chinese entertainment cultural space, is what's happening to the Chinese internet. Because as you know, China has a different internet from the one you and I use. And increasingly, media production, distribution, consumption is happening in the digital space, everywhere. And the Chinese internet, given its distinctiveness, is actually a very interesting arena for research and scholarship. In the book I mentioned earlier, I used this phrase in my chapter, cyber capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Because every major digital property that exists in this space of communication and media, China has its equivalent, as you see here. Search engines, online shopping, messenger, video, etc., etc. No other country has managed it. Right? So people outside China have a very, and I find it particularly problematic being in an American college, very limited perception of Chinese internet, in the sense that it is about control and censorship, which is a very important aspect. I don't want to deny that, extremely important aspect. But that's just one part of a much bigger picture. You could argue, and I've done that in that chapter, that precisely because it was a controlled system, China was able to develop its own internet. No other country has done it. We are quite happy to trade our data on Facebook and Google and what have you. So we can't have our own Google. We have 1 billion people. We can't even produce a smartphone in India, 1 billion people. 70% of the market is owned by the Chinese in this country. It's interesting. And how did they do that? It's worth thinking about. And is it possible that we're obsessed with the Western discourse about China, which is about censorship and control? And it's like this old, Jain story about the elephant. So you're looking at the tail and saying, this is everything. And then somebody looking at the trunk. Actually, it's a big thing. It's a very complex thing. And that complex, now these companies, Alibaba, etc., they're not just operating in China. They are in this country. They are in dozens of countries. TikTok, I didn't know TikTok was a Chinese company. In fact, next month I'm taking students to TikTok's headquarters to get some idea what are you guys doing, Because it's huge in Indonesia, it's huge in this country. I didn't know it was a Chinese company until a few months ago. So in that space, there is a very interesting new emergence of a power center which is not controlled by Washington. It's a very significant point to keep in mind. And then, of course, 5G. The current problem with the US is, it's much broader debate, but 5G is a very important part of that. Because China is ahead of everybody else in that arena. As you see this chart, right? They're going to introduce it next year. Or I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the Chinese mobile payment system is the most sophisticated in the world. Most sophisticated. In 3 years, they gave 1 billion people a system which works. I couldn't contact my colleagues to come here because in Delhi, right? So I say to everybody, every shop, I say, यार चीन से compete करना है भैया, कुछ करो. आपको डेनमार्क से compete नहीं करना. There are 4 million people. चीन से compete करना. चीन से सीखना. I'm sorry, I'm using Hindi. So they are also a very interesting area for Chinese media's expansion, as more and more people, especially younger people, consume their media on mobile, right? And 5G is also about not just communication, it's Internet of Things. So it actually encompasses a much wider area. And there are issues about surveillance and, privacy, etc. So I'm just nearly coming to my end of my presentation, and will be time for discussion. So what does it tell us about globalization of China's media and why it matters? You may recall a couple of years ago at the World Economic Forum, for the first time, the Chinese president was invited as the keynote speaker. And you can find his speech on YouTube. It's in Mandarin, but the text is available. And here was a leader from a very controlled system talking about free markets and, capitalism, etc., etc. The kind of language that one heard from a US president. And the contrast could not have been stronger because the US president and the Brussels bureaucracy were talking a very different language. They were talking about deglobalization. Next year, it was Mr. Modi, in fact, who spoke as keynote speaker at World Economic Forum, and his focus was on culture and communication. It was a very interesting difference, but anyway. So that's also an interesting sign of how the broader world is relating to this new kind of, I use the phrase Sino-globalization, which is, I have a question mark, so we can talk about that. The last picture on that slide is they have a World Internet Forum every year, where the top elite of internet governance and internet economy is there. And they also have this, some of you may have heard it, something called Internet Plus, which is an idea, it's like Digital India, but much more sophisticated, to include digitization in every aspect of development. And unlike India, they have actually delivered it. So then the question arises in terms of broader global media flows. Is the emergence of Chinese media flows, are they contrary to the dominant Western, US, UK, and English language media, or are they complementary to it? Because as I said, in terms of journalism, they have not really done anything to upset anybody. It's famously bland and bureaucratic. An interesting contrast would be with RT. In this book, which I have just published, it's the third edition of my book, which has had several translations. I have a little case study about what I call RT effect. So you had the CNN effect, and then you had the Al Jazeera effect, and now we have an RT effect, in the sense that what RT broadcasts has an impact on bureaucracies, think tanks, policy people, journalists in various countries, especially in Europe and in the United States. RT is not interested in other parts of the world. China, in contrast, or Chinese media in contrast, is not contra, deliberately so, unless it's the story which directly impinges on Chinese interests. Then they will go to town in their own way. But by and large, it's a very bland, as I said, very, there are no edges, right? And that, I think, is a deliberate policy. Let people get used to CGTN's logo. Let people get used to the idea that there is another kind of journalism, which is not just talking about coups and earthquakes and how horrible the third world is. Yeah, and that has a currency in the majority world, and I think the Chinese policymakers understand that. But I don't think it's contra. It's actually in some ways complementary, if you think in those terms. I just repeat this point. I think it's significant. That's why I'm repeating it. That so far, outside China, the understanding of China is confined to as an economic power, market share, that kind of stuff. There's very little engagement with the culture which goes back to 5,000 years. There's very little understanding of Chinese history, Chinese philosophy. Same with our country. We have no idea. They have no idea of ours, and we have our culture, history. We have none of theirs. But perhaps most importantly, China, despite its extraordinary growth in the last 2 decades, still remains a developing country. Even in their official discourses, even under President Xi, they don't shy from that fact that we are still a developing country. We are not a developed country. We aspire to become a developed country, but we are not a developed country as yet. And I had the privilege to travel in the rural parts of China also, and I have not seen the kind of poverty that you see in our country. Yeah? So something they have done that we have not. So then that raises the question, is there a different model for development? A state-led model, not an NGO model, where the state has actually delivered for a vast majority of its population. And is it at all possible that we have been brainwashed by Oxfam and by DFID and by USAID to think about development in a certain way? Not just us, a lot of developing world. And the Chinese has shown something else. They have shown that you can, if not eliminate, you can considerably reduce poverty. And you see that when you go to China. And as an Indian, you see it more than a European or American would see. Yeah? Because they don't know what poverty is. We know, we grew up in a poor country. So that struck me the first time. I've been going since 2004, every year, more than once. I've taught in various universities in China. And you see the difference. And it is striking. So I want to end with some data. And I want your indulgence for another 30 seconds. To see as clearly as one possibly can in terms of differences between India and China in relation to dealing with poverty, extreme poverty. So this is from Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals from the World Bank, 2017. इसमें highlighter है? This one? No, okay, it doesn't matter. So if you look at the first bit of the chart, 1990, there were 756 million people in China living in extreme poverty. That is less than $2 a day, yeah, in terms of purchasing power parity. In India, there were only 338, I say only advisedly, 338 million people living in abject poverty. Which means that China had double the number of people living in extreme poverty in 1990. Now, those of you who have longer memories would remember that China opened up to the world after Deng's death, late 70s. By 1990, they already have, Mao's death, Deng's death, no, sorry. By 1990, they already have those economic zones. They're already the factory to the world. They still have 756 million people living in abject poverty. Fast forward to 2013, it's 25 million. We have 218 million. I was showing this to some colleagues in China last year, and this very distinguished professor came to me and he said, next time you are here, that figure will be 0. And I trust him. So these are old figures. We have done much better than that. But we still have the distinction of having largest number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. To our shame. Right? So then we have to ask, kya galat hu? Where did we go wrong? Is there something with our models? Are we borrowing ideas, models, money from sources which actually are not helping eliminate poverty? Because we want, people to live, I assume that is the case. The leadership want people to live, a better standard of life. There's also money to be made for corporates. So something is wrong, in my view. Something is fundamentally wrong. Now, this is not the forum to discuss that, but I just wanted to end with that note that we have to get beyond the obsession that we have about this. This was the greatest democracy because they're wonderful. But, if we're not being able to deliver to a large proportion of the population, we got to ask that question, where did we go wrong? And I think something also is to be said in relation to our media, which Nandan alluded to earlier. We both, you've been here much longer, but I have had a small experience of working in the media in this country, and we used to have a pretty sophisticated media system and publicly engaged media. Today you don't have that. With honorable exception. I see Pallav Bagla sitting there. I'm a great admirer of your work, by the way. So, these guys are exceptional. They are in minority. Much of what you see on the 400 plus channels we have is I use my words advisedly, unadulterated rubbish. It's not that there's no money. When we were generous, there was no money. But there was standard. Today, we have a lot of money. But so this whole idea of development and how do we deal with poverty is actually off the agenda. And therefore, we are quite happy to talk about banalities and inane things every night at the top of our voices. And the same people, as you change the channel, same person is saying the same thing on a different channel. So I think there is something for us to think about, whether we need to think that there could be other models. I'm not, by any stretch of imagination, justifying that we should have a controlled totalitarian system. But I think we need to think about how we can deal with poverty where the state has a much more important role in making it as a priority affair, and how media in that can also contribute. And then the final thought on that, if we are able to do that within a democratic setup, in a multi-party state, we could be a model for a large number of countries to follow. And finally, given that we had this amazing and very distinguished history of journalism and media more broadly, we could be in the global space where we are, in entertainment we are there, but in news and current affairs we are a major absence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thussu. I think that was a very rich and insightful presentation. I certainly learned a lot. I'm not going to pontificate because unfortunately we are we are telescoping into another event, so we'll have to wind up at about 5 to 5. So I'll throw it open to discussion straight away. And yes, ma'am, do introduce yourself.
I'm Srimati Chakravarti, retired professor in the University of Delhi and professor of Chinese studies. Now, very fascinating presentation. Now, I have 2 or 3 questions. The first one is regarding BRI. Of course, you said that it's a great project and something like that is unprecedented in history of the world, very different still from the Marshall Plan. But I've spoken to some Chinese academics. Some of them have said that this BRI is mainly to maintain the strength of the Chinese economy, the growth rate, especially in the construction sector. You see, the Chinese have finished building everything that they could: roads, railways, airports, shipyards. So now what happens to the construction industry? So if they go out to other countries, they will sustain themselves. That is one opinion I've got from Chinese themselves, in a very free and frank way. They said that is the most important reason. The construction industry is an example, but otherwise to retain the health of the Chinese economy. That's one question. Second one is, this has to do with the media, social media. You don't get Google, you don't get WhatsApp in China, but if you download a VPN app, you can see everything. Sure. Now, I was wondering how and why the Chinese government doesn't control the VPN, because when I was in China last year for about 6 weeks, every day, of course the app would disappear now and then, but I was able to get everything, WhatsApp, Google, everything that is forbidden in China without any problem. And I'm surprised that the Chinese government doesn't do anything. Anyway, you'll probably have an answer for this. Okay, the third question is about CGTN. There is this anchor called Yang Hui. Okay, he, I think, is the world's best anchor. Without raising his voice, he can. Without raising his voice, he can bring the debate and the discussion, towards his side. Okay, I think our anchor, especially Arnab Goswami and others, must learn from him. If you have seen his programs, this is. I find it really fascinating. Yang Hui. Okay, that's all.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, please. No. By the way, Srimati Chakravarti is allowed.
Hi, Rocco Weglars. Because I'm wearing the old Ausaid one, I couldn't help but comment on your comment about China versus India. I was actually working for the Chinese and Australian government in China at about the same stage of development as India is at now. And China looked very similar to India then, and India's on the same trajectory. So there's no need to panic or anything, and there's no need to overly laud.
Look at that figure again.
Or draw the line.
I've
looked at that figure and the projections, which I've seen where they started and I've seen where they ended. And I also can tell you that if there is one major reason that India won't catch up, is if you're a business person looking to set up, you'll set up in China, not India.
Sure.
Because in China, it's not, it's when both governments got out of the way. It's not what they were doing. It's what they stopped doing things that the economy took off in both places.
Yeah.
And China was in a greater place to take advantage of that because it had an educated population. Hundreds of millions of people could move off the farms directly into factories, run with American ideas, Japanese money and management, and start working. That's not the case in India. But my question is, in terms of, yes, the Chinese have got the technical reach across the world, including subtle things, like because of its power, people just won't publish things about. I know Indian journalists who won't publish what they've seen in China. They've visited Xinjiang. They won't publish it because their contacts with the powerful Chinese economy is so important to them that they won't publish in the newspapers what they've seen because they want to keep those links alive. So there's that sort of power that comes without even all this money they've spent. There's also the power that comes from most of the publishing in the English language press now happens in China.
Yeah.
And China has a long list of things that you cannot publish in China, even if you're publishing for an audience overseas, and those books will never actually be distributed in China. And there's several books in Australia that have not been published because the printers, and this is potentially a make in India possibility.
So what's the question?
The question,
yes.
To get to the question.
Yes.
You had too interesting a talk, so that's raised too many interesting issues.
No, I'm just conscious of time, and there might be other questions. Yeah.
Are there actually any figures, hopefully non-Chinese figures, because everybody lies about their own viewership and readership?
Yeah. Figures about?
Who's actually watching?
Yes, good question.
Who's actually reading?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, okay.
Okay, and one last question, just as an example of how not to ask a question. I'm sure Pallav will give us a question.
One small comment.
Ah.
Pallav Bagla, science editor, NDTV, and correspondent, Science Magazine. Thanks a lot, Professor Thussu, for mentioning me. I didn't know you watched some of what I did.
Every day I watch NDTV.
Oh, thanks a lot. Appreciate that. The question is, we hear so much about the press being the fourth estate and a pillar which kind of gives a sense of semblance to what is happening. In China, if there is no free press and they are still developing at the pace they are, then what is wrong? Are we doing something wrong? Are they doing something right? I fail to understand what is happening. We every time hear they will implode, then there's no free press. They are not imploding.
Where do you hear that from? What is the source?
Mostly in India.
No, but where is the original source? Is it New York Times, Economist, The Guardian, etc.?
Yes.
So remember, New York Times has had a very distinguished history of lying about the world. So, sorry. No, that was the question I thought. No?
Yeah. The second part was.
Sorry.
Many times I have been interviewed both by CGTN and Tsinghua, and I find the people who come to interview me very sophisticated and sharp.
Yes. But why should that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me.
So, I mean, it's a very sophisticated country. I'm sorry. It's a very you see, very interesting difference which we should remember in India. The Chinese elite is highly educated. Lalu Yadav will not become defense minister of China. It won't be done. They have to have expertise. They know what they're talking about. So I think हमारे यहाँ सब चलता है ना. उनके यहाँ बड़ा standard है. They have really very high quality. So it's like, I'm sorry to say this, but this is a strange comment to make. Why should they not be sophisticated? है ना? That is the question you should be asking. कि आपको ये किसने कहा कि वो sophisticated नहीं होगी, कुछ Chinese. They have the same things about India. Oh, we went to India and they were very clever people. So मैंने कहा यार, how can they not be clever? They run a country of 1.2 billion people. So these are the assumptions they have because that is a bigger problem in the sense of the flow of ideas. They are getting about their information about India from the sources I mentioned earlier, and vice versa for us. There's very little. Atul Aneja, you remember? He is the Hindu correspondent in Beijing, a very old friend of mine. And we meet and we talk about. I said, there's not enough interest about China in India, in the Hindu, which is a serious newspaper, right? So if you were to do a study of Indian newspaper or your own channel, with due respect, how much is there on China? And vice versa. They have even less and even more distorted.
First, Srimati's question.
Okay.
The
So
other is-
that's true. And it's not just academics saying that. It's well known. They have reached a saturation point. They want to expand. And what's wrong with it? Let there be more roads built. Yeah. So I think it's essentially extending Chinese infrastructure to the rest of the world. And as you know, there is no free lunch. So they're not doing it just to make life easier for Afghans. There is a geopolitical agenda, and that's very obvious. VPN, there's a fantastic book that a Harvard professor wrote a couple of years ago about the Chinese censorship regime, where he argued that actually they know exactly what people are watching or not watching, and that's good. They know this far and no further. There are certain things which are taboo, but other things are okay. So they have VPN, but they're monitoring that VPN. So it's the system within system. In terms of that's a kind of censorship. You're right. That's a kind of censorship, but a very subtle.
Maybe you sit here.
Sorry.
And finally, CGT, and there is even better journalist there. Her name is Xin Lu. She runs a program called The Point.
Most of them are Chinese of American or British.
Xin might be she. I think she went to Oxford. I'm not sure, but she's very good.
Most anchors are from the Western countries.
The university where I was, a lot of them have studied there. So it's a very that's their normal training. That's not so, and they go to Columbia Journalism School, etc. Sorry. So final. I wish I knew that. There are no credible figures. You can check their website. They will say so many millions are watching us, but there's no credible figure. But the point is, it is not about viewership. They are not. If it was a commercial operation, it will close in 2 weeks, right? It is something else. It is part of a bigger geopolitical agenda. It's part of Chinese version of international communication. So money is not a concern. How many people are watching it? What's the advertising budget? That's none of their, because there's enough money put in it.
What's worth in Australia is mainly the Chinese veteran community.
Yeah.
I've watched a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, I'm a journalist, my name is Surya. How would you describe the average Chinese journalist? Is he or she, do they have party affiliations? Do they come through a fairly rigorous process of training as journalists? What kind of training is it?
There are, sorry.
We'll take two.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, please.
Sir, since the Chinese version
Name first.
Sir, Radhika, I'm a research intern here. Sir, since you mentioned that the Chinese version of the Belt and Road Initiative has been portrayed as a development, like we're building roads and it's solely based in development, don't you think the BRI is a manifestation of the Middle Kingdom syndrome?
Okay.
No more girls who want to ask questions. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Thussu, for that wonderful presentation. My name is Yash. I'm a research intern here, otherwise a student of law. So my first question is, insofar as the concept of Sino-globalization is concerned, what's the effect of Mandarin not having a trans-Chinese, beyond Chinese, speaking population, insofar as in comparison to English, and that acceptance kind of, does it make a difference?
Very good question.
And the second one is that when I'm not sure whether this is within the purview of discussion, so sorry, sir, but the Chinese jurisprudential method is that they do not employ Western narratives of law and, having a judgment and having a for and an against. There's more belief in mediation and reconciliation without appointing Western methodologies of, jurisprudence, etc. So do you see an effect insofar as in India, if I would compare, there be an overdose of democracy and an overdose of jurisprudence taken in from the West, which hence today, if we see these figures in your arguments, principally fall out of place in our country?
Very good. Okay. I forgot now.
Surya was average
Journalist, huh?
journalist.
I've been going to China, as I said, regularly to journalism schools, and journalism is very sarkari, if you like. It's basically they're working for party or can say very limited independent press or media more broadly. Although in the digital space, some things are beginning to emerge. So they are not. I mean, they're good in their craft, what they do, but they are really not into asking critical questions, because that's not what they are encouraged to do even at the journalism schools. And I find that a fundamental difference from what we do in India, for instance, or in the rest of the world. So therefore, journalism becomes very bland. It's not that there's always an order from the top. It's the culture is such that you won't criticize unless it's directly affecting Chinese interests. Then they will be good. Otherwise, they would be very kind of bland. So it's not a free press. I mean, that's not, that's obviously the case. And censorship regimes are very strict, even in the VPN arena. Middle Kingdom, yeah. I don't know. I think it's too early to say, because BRI might go horribly wrong. Yeah. Because there are already cases in our neighborhood where the countries are saying we can't repay this debt, we got to cancel this contract, right? So it's early stages to claim that status, but the aspiration is to create a different kind of globalization. That is certainly the case, and if you think of globalization debates, it was really Anglo-globalization. It was corporate, US led. That seems to be coming to an end. And there is a different kind of globalization with an Asian accent, I would say. Because China is not the only one. We are not quite there, but we are getting there. So, it's going to be an interesting, you might think of mandals maybe, I don't know. But English, Mandarin, that's an excellent question. But you see, again, you have to think, my problem is history पढ़ी है, मेरा MA history में. So you have to read history to understand the world. So if you think of Mughal Empire, right? Aurangzeb dies when? Do you remember? वो historian है भाई. नहीं, अच्छा. When does the Mughal Empire actually end? Formally? कितना फर्क है? 150 साल. 150 years. So अभी तो इब्तिदा है. It's only the beginning. Right? And also remember, they are learning English very, very rapidly. And our friends from Australia and Britain and US have made a huge amount of money by teaching Chinese English. I remember when I went the first time, I was talking to a very senior like dean. I said, why did you send your kids to India? They will learn English for 1/10 of the cost. They said, we wrote 10 letters to Delhi University, apologies. No response. Right? So, that if we had sense, we should teach Chinese English, make billions. Right? So, it will take time. And so they are very pragmatic. They're saying, okay, we're going to learn English because that, like it or not, it is the language of global communication and more importantly, global commerce. But also I would add, think of the Chinese internet, which is in Mandarin, and it works. So maybe your children or grandchildren certainly will have to learn Mandarin if they want a decent job. Jurisprudence is out of my area of expertise, but I would say that it's not just jurisprudence. If you see what we teach in our universities, what are the books and ideas in political philosophy, in history, they all come from not just Western, but Anglo-American, the West, right? So it is a part of a much bigger problem about epistemology and about how knowledge is, the hierarchy of knowledge, who set it up. And of course, there is a very interesting discussion about that in this country, but unfortunately, it is not informed enough. Yeah? We need good people to engage with that discussion. Actually, you can't leave it to people who are not educated properly. And then you can develop not just in judicial case, because that's a fundamental problem in this country, but also our universities. We know about Shakespeare, we don't know about Kalidas. If you don't know about, if you got, it's not considered, illiterate if you don't know about Chanakya. But Machiavelli, if you're politics, you must be considered, you're not well read. Right? And look at Arthashastra, that's this big. Princes, this much, and very ordinary text. So, I rest my case. It's not just, so it's a much bigger problem. And young people like you, I'm glad you're asking that question. Because you got to work on it. You say, well, we got to have our own discourse.
I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at our system, it's borrowed, right?
Yes.
The whole concept of liberal democracy is, I won't say it's alien, I'm not saying it's bad, but it should have been imbued with some elements of our own tradition, our own culture.
But it is
Just like the Chinese have done with capitalism. I mean, they
Yes,
have their
yes,
own
absolutely.
characteristics of capitalism. Okay, we have the last round of questions. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, sure. I'll be very sure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm Nirmala. I'm the Minister of the Sri Lanka High Commission in New Delhi. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. It was very, very comprehensive, and I really liked it. And just want to ask you, you were talking about the trade connections between China and the whole world, and how the Chinese media has expanded and the BRI. In that context, I want to know, what does it mean, what does this expansion of media in China means for India, and what this expansion means for South Asia in general?
Right.
Is it a driving force or a threat?
Thank you.
Yes, please. And the last question is
Thank you. My name is Madhavan Kutti. I'm a senior journalist from
we have
Kerala.
time limits, so.
Sorry.
Excuse me, can I go ahead?
Please go ahead.
That is my prerogative.
I'm from Kerala.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we have a model of development, as you know, the alternative, which has been very highly acclaimed by somebody like Amartya Sen.
Right.
Now,
Yes.
I would like your view on democracy as development, because I've been listening to your kind of very positive evaluation of what's happening in China.
Yes.
And the whole idea, the concept of human rights, freedom of speech, nothing being discussed in even collaterally.
Yeah.
So I mean, so is your praise of this Chinese model and this comparison, how does it square with our appreciation of Amartya Sen's concept, democracy as development?
Sure. Thank you.
Sir, Ameya Kelkar, Research Assistant at ORF. Thank you for the presentation. It was a real treat listening to you. I just have one question regarding Djibouti. In Western media, basically China's expansion in Djibouti is viewed as America's military is going to go down, Africa's going to go haywire. Through what lens is China looking at this? Are they looking at it as a sort of military expansion, or are they just looking at it as another trade partner for China to, get into their fold?
Okay. Okay, so first friend from Sri Lanka. The Chinese media's presence in South Asia, in my view, is very limited. Although in India, I don't know whether anybody watches Chinese television or reads Chinese newspapers, unless they are China specialists. And for them, it has not been a priority area also. Yeah, they have been thinking of and have been investing in Africa quite a lot. And they are also very keen to make sure that the US and Europe gets a kind of rosy picture, positive picture about Chinese globalization. So they are very much sensitive to these audiences, basically Western audiences, and in the developing world, mostly in Africa. Having said that, they have plans to expand, and I, as an Indian, I find that all the time they are very interested in India, not because they have I have to say, they have respect for, because there's a Buddhist connection, there's that awareness that this is a civilization. That awareness you see in educated Chinese. But the more immediate interest is the market. So they want to find out more. Okay, you've got Bengali, you've got Tamil, you've got Telugu. How do we get into these markets? They're actually teaching their kids Bengali and Tamil and other languages. So I think in terms of the impact for South Asia is very limited and is likely to remain so unless, the CGTN expands in India. There are a lot of good journalists who are looking for work. Human rights and the Sen model, absolutely. I'm sure, sorry, I didn't have time to expand on that. Even these figures, when you see these amazing success stories, there is also a story about the environmental degradation and the sociological change that China has experienced in the last 2 decades. You have to understand this has not been done in history before. This kind of unprecedented growth, the scale and scope is so incredible. There's no comparison in history. And this has been achieved largely peacefully, right? So there is.
And very repressively.
I said largely peacefully, right?
And very repressively.
Yes,
Yeah.
but again, you have to go to China, I don't know whether you've been, to actually feel whether it is repressed or not. You will see, you will feel it's a capitalist country. You don't get a sense of Big Brother watching you. But that's not to say there isn't that problem. We mentioned that there is a problem. There is a system which is it's a one-party state. Human rights don't matter in the way they do here, or they matter in the judicial system is very much party-centered. There are journalists who work for party. There are academics who are paid by the party. So all that is there. I'm not for a second denying that. But that's why I ended my presentation by saying that we could actually offer a different model that you could develop within a democratic setup.
Kerala is a model.
But Kerala is, unfortunately, sir, a small part of this very vast country.
Okay, but I'm just.
We also have Bihar and Jharkhand. Djibouti, it's. Why would they? Djibouti, as you know, obviously, is a very important place for geostrategic reasons. So it makes perfect sense for a risen power to have a military base there. And as I said at the very beginning, that if you compare it, what there is, in relation to US or France or Germany, it's very, very limited. But they're expanding. They talk about a base in Afghanistan. There is a base in South China Sea. So I think one has to be realistic and expect that to grow. There will be many more Chinese bases. If China is investing trillions of dollars, it would need protection, right? So why did Europeans have these empires? Why are the all the kind of global policing done by Americans? They have interests. It's very simple geopolitical reality of life. Of course, they will put a very different, image and also a different spin on it, which is understandable. But you and I are clever enough to read between the lines. So it's an entirely strategic base and very significant one for us.
Once again, I would like to thank